So this paper is about the process of creating a new office for a new saint. One office was finally abandoned when the other got approved by the General Chapter of the Order of Friars Preachers and then the Pope. I wanted to zoom out a little bit and discuss the two competing offices as compilation versus original composition. Research on liturgical offices in recent years has been able to identify a considerable and yet incomplete number of poet-composers of sacred chant. Most were either anonymous or considered as such. As Ludwig Fincher suggested in 1974 in his article Die Entstehung des Komponisten, borrowing practices and the existence of a common pool of melodies do not necessarily exclude authorship. Whereas in modern approach, creative work must imperatively demonstrate originality, in the late Middle Ages and the Renaissance, borrowing and the Contrafactum technique were seen as legitimate techniques of creation. In general, new offices served often as individual markers of unique practices in new female convents that belonged to the observant reform. Using the specific example of two offices dedicated to Catherine of Siena, from which one was imported to the Portuguese Dominican convent of Jesus in Aveiro, we see how this convent dealt with the complexity of reorganizing and selecting chants during the early transmission stages. This case study will allow us to address some of the challenges in office studies, such as the desire to have signature offices for new female convents, the difficulties of adapting an office from another convent, the multitude of variants of transmission from hagiographic sources, and the choice of texts and melodies. I will not touch upon the subject of authorship in general, but speak en passant about authorship in liturgical offices, where the main problem is the difficulty in differentiating between authors of texts and melodies. Let us return to Fincher's article I mentioned before. He positions the emergence of the composer in the 14th century in France and Italy and identifies three aspects. Firstly, an interest in the composer, as we can see in the sources themselves. Secondly, the development of a personal musical style. And thirdly, the shift towards self-expression via the music. Focusing on the second aspect, Fincher explained the more individualized styles by the specialization of the composers in specific genres and the mastering of certain compositional techniques, but also by the growing competition between the composers from different Italian cities. The creators of liturgical offices only form a very small part of these composers. Before I go to the offices themselves, I want to share here some outcomes of my recent bibliographical research on office creators that may give some more context on the Catherine of Siena offices. I made a survey of 55 creators' names, from which 53 are male and 2 female. That created offices for 73 saint figures or groups, 50 male figures, including 5 for Jesus and 20 female figures. The gradual increase of Marian devotion and renewed spirituality can explain the rising number from the 13th century on. I surveyed at least 15 other offices of female saints with known creators, which you can see here, 2 in the 9th and 10th century, 5 in the 11th century, and 7 from the 13th century onwards for new saints such as Elizabeth of Hungary, Maria of Oigny, Birgitta, Eileen of Skövde, and Catherine of Siena, or older saints such as the 11,000 Virgins and Anna. Looking at these authored offices for female saints, we see an apparent increase from the 13th century on, which means a greater need for these figures as female monasticism develops. But of course, these numbers should be compared to non-authored offices from the same period, which wasn't our purpose here. I was more interested in signature offices that help to shape the profile of either new or newly reformed convents. Let us now return to our case of two authors from the 15th century, the period described by Fincher I referred to earlier. I start with some context about Catherine of Siena. She was born in 1347 in Siena and became a member of Dominican tertiaries at age 16. Her confessor was Raymond of Capua, who, after she died in 1380, became Master General of the order. Catherine was a prolific author of theological and mystical texts and church politically active during the period of the Great Western Schism. She was canonized by Pope Pius II in 1461, and the year after that, the General Chapter installed her feast. Catherine of Siena was the fifth Dominican saint and the first woman. The first saint was the order's founder, Dominic, in 1234, followed by Peter Martyr in 1253. Thomas Aquinas was added to this illustrious list in 1323. After that, it took some time before the two figures of the Great Schism, Vincent Ferrer, who supported Clement VII in Avignon, and Catherine of Siena, who supported Urban VI in Rome, after having unsuccessfully advocated for the return of the papacy to Rome. They got canonized in 1455 for Vincent and 1461 for Catherine. Antonino of Florence was the following Dominican saint, canonized almost 70 years later in 1523-24. Following her confessor and hagiographer, Raymond of Capua, Catherine of Siena joined in 1363 a lay group of Dominican Mantellate. She became a leading figure in what Alison Moore called an observant dynamic of recreating tradition. The order considered her, as Claire Taylor-Jones aptly put it, a spiritual mother and themselves as heiress of St. Dominic's spirituality. One part of her actions consisted in spiritual, private, or group teachings to other women that dedicated their lives to charity and prayer, some of them lay or members of semi-contemplative or contemplative communities. But they were also of the counseling or preaching type, for example, when she met the Pope and his entourage. Catherine's book, Libro di Divina Dottrina, and its Latin translation, Liber Divine Doctrine, played an essential role in the reception of her texts in the 15th century, especially in Italy. St. Catherine's Vita spread very quickly from Italy, principally from Venice, to other Dominican provinces like Teutonia, where we also find later on early sources of liturgical dedicated to her. St. Catherine's actions and writings and the actions of her disciples inspired the observant reform at the end of the 14th and in the 15th centuries, especially in female houses of the Dominican order. The spreading of Catherine's life immensely helped promote her canonization, which went through in 1461 during the reign of Pope Pius II. The saint's cult formed immediately after that and was approved by the Dominican General Chapter in 1473. Before we discuss the offices, I would like to say something about the feast's date, which was movable. Those dates often posed problems because of conflicting calendars. Catherine died on April 29 in 1380, but this day was already taken by the Dominican Saint Peter Martyr. So Pope Pius II decided to celebrate the new feast on the first Sunday of May. The first problem to be dealt with was where to note Catherine's feast in the liturgical calendars. In 1468, the General Chapter decided on May 30. Claire Taylor-Jones has shown that scribes of liturgical calendars in German sources note Catherine either on April 30 or on any available free space around that date. But the feast remained to be celebrated on the first Sunday of May. This created a lot of conflicts, including the cases when the Easter octave coincided with the feast, in years when Easter was very late. This list shows the official changes of Catherine's feast day between 1461 and 1600. So the fact that the feast did not have a regular position on the calendar posed indeed a problem with the proper and stable introduction of a new liturgical office. One of the two liturgical offices for Catherine of Siena was a rhymed office, starting with the Vesper antiphon Virginem Catharinam Maximis. This office is transmitted in two South German sources from the convents of Landshut near München. This is in the first source from München, and Diessenhofen near Constance, the second from Rome. Maybe the rhymed office was created in the Dominican Teutonia province and more widespread than we imagine today when we see only these two sources. Both sources can be dated to the period immediately following the introduction of the feast. The one from Landshut can be dated to 1480 and the other source from after 1461. Here you can see the office and its melodic borrowings. The office has an abbreviated form with only one nocturne that comprises 3 antiphons and 3 responsories. This table shows that the melodies of the office have almost entirely been compiled from 3 different offices. Even the original positions have been kept, except for 2 chants, whose melodies come from the Vincent Ferrer office, marked in green in the table. Terry Brown has studied this in his dissertation and demonstrated the different melodic sources of the office. He named the quite significant differences between the Landshut and St. Katharinenthal versions, independent settings of the same text. Only the 2 chants for the octave have new melodies, and they were maybe composed in St. Katharinenthal. If we had more different sources of this office, we probably could better understand its genesis and transmission. It is also possible that the other official office replaced the Virginem Catharinam office in some German sources afterwards. What I find interesting here is that we can see the construction of this tight group of 4 Dominican saints, intertwined by the borrowed melodies and distinguishable by the individual texts. Out of 17 chants, there were 2 new and 5 borrowed melodies from each saint, Peter Martyr, Thomas Aquinas, and Vincent Ferrer. These borrowings were only possible because of the close rhyme forms in the different offices. The borrowed melodies are quite equally spread over the liturgical office, Peter Martyr in Matins, 2 antiphons and 2 responsories, and in Laudes, 1 antiphon, Thomas Aquinas in Matins, 1 antiphon, Laudes, 3 antiphons, and second Vesper, 1 antiphon, and Vincent Ferrer in first Vespers, 2 antiphons, Matins, 1 responsory, and Laudes, 2 antiphons. This mix is at the same time a reference to the illustrious Dominican trio and an integration into the Dominican pool of saints. Interestingly, all these feasts fell in the close period between March 7, Thomas Aquinas, April 5, Vincent Ferrer, and April 29, Peter Martyr. It illustrates at the same time the struggle to create immediately an original office with new texts and melodies. The office meant to last came from Italy. The prose office, starting with the antiphon Inmortali laudes, was decreed as the official office for Catherine's feast in 1473. Its authorship can be attributed to Tommaso Schifaldi, and it forms a part of the hagiographic dossier leading first to Catherine's canonization and then to establishing a solid cult with a liturgical office. It has survived in much more copies, as you can see here, and there are only examples. And there are, of course, also sources from other countries. I only put sources from Italy, France, Germany, Spain, and Portugal. The complete office with 3 nocturnes, chants for first and second vespers, laudes, and for the octave is transmitted in Italian, French, and Spanish sources, but from the very beginning, the office had to be shortened because of the date of Catherine's feast I mentioned before. All offices between Easter and Trinity were celebrated in the one nocturne form only. Was Scifaldi aware of this constraint when he composed his office? As we have seen, the discussion about the date was still ongoing, so it was still possible to hope for a date that allowed for the 3 nocturne form. The sources show that the feast was abbreviated, but not always in the same way. We could also interpret it as the greatest honors given to the saint by the complete office, even if the pragmatic shortening was used in the liturgical practice in the different convents. We can see that in Castile circulated also the full version from Italy, which you can see here in the slide. Oh yes, that was this. This is from the breviary of Isabella of Castile. Since the 2 sources are breviaries, they are not specifically linked to a convent's liturgy, and there was maybe no need to accommodate within the actual liturgical practice. All sources that came from Dominican convents, male or female, rather have the abbreviated form, as we can see here, for example, in the antiphona from the French convent in Poissy. Let us now move to Portugal, more precisely to the female convent of Aveiro in the northern part, not far from Porto. A small group of noblewomen was instrumental in the creation of a religious community in Aveiro in 1458, which eventually evolved into the Convent of Jesus, receiving papal approval from Pope Pius II in 1461, the same year as Catherine was canonized. Under Prioress Maria de Ataide, the convent became a thriving community. During the entire period of the foundation and the establishment of the observant reform, the Convent of Jesus had a flourishing scriptorium where the sisters copied and illuminated liturgical manuscripts for their own use. As the convent implemented the observant reform right at its foundation, the chant books from the 15th and early 16th century were produced for daily use in this formative period. 17 liturgical chant books from this time period have survived in convent's library, 6 antiphonariys, 2 graduals, 7 processionaries, and 2 breviaries. The office of St. Catherine of Siena has been noted in the antiphona number 27. It starts with the rubric Sancte Caterina de Senis Officium a Papa Pius II Editum. We can see here on the table the rearrangement in Aveiro. While the antiphons remained in place, the responsories were exchanged against those from the 3rd nocturne. And the Magnificat antiphon for the octave is missing here in Aveiro. The office of St. Catherine of Siena is not only the signature of this reformed convent, but also it shows the difficulties with its shortening and the variants of her name. So you can see that Katharina is written with a K or with a C. It's not stable transmission yet, which illustrates the process of introducing a new office into new liturgical manuscripts. The next step in my research will be to assemble more Iberian versions with notated melodies and to compare them to the earlier Italian version. In conclusion, the examination of the offices dedicated to Catherine of Siena provides insight into the nuanced processes of establishment, reorganization, and selection in the period of its creation, when also the observant reform was changing and recreating the Dominican communities, males as well as females. I haven't looked so much at the melodies themselves at the moment, in order to be able to zoom out and resemble more sources from Italy and the Iberian territories. For the second office, I focused on the Portuguese Dominican convent of Jesus in Aveiro. In its formative years, the convent, while shaping its distinctive liturgical practices, consciously embraced a recently crafted official office, departing from the earlier provisional version compiled from diverse sources. This strategic shift underscored the convent's move towards a more standardized and formal liturgical structure. Despite this commitment to conformity, individual choices persisted, exemplified in Aveiro, where the sisters opted for the entire series of responsories from the third nocturne over the first, showcasing the dynamic interplay between standardization and localized preferences within the broader framework of liturgical practices. Thank you very much.